Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. Welcome to the University of Victoria's Middle East Discussion Group, or MEDG, hosted at the Center for Global Studies. This is our third event since lockdowns began. It's actually the third of 3 book talks. We also bring in speakers not just for book talks, and we also meet to discuss current issues. But since the lockdowns began, we're still working out this format, and because we're mostly used to meeting in small rooms and with small groups. This is our first open event, widely promoted outside of our community, though our past 2 events have also been recorded, and we're working on putting those online. This event is being recorded, and we also anticipate it going online in the coming weeks. So just for protocol or etiquette, we do ask that you keep your microphones muted during this presentation and discussion and your cameras off. It makes for a less distracting presentation and environment and a cleaner recording. There will be plenty of time for questions and discussion after our speaker has concluded. And I think he's probably going to speak for maybe 20 minutes or so. We have 90 minutes altogether if it goes that long. And for questions and comments, we're going to go first come, first serve. And the best way for me to moderate that is if you queue up in the chat room. So if you just write in the chat room that you have a question or a comment, then I'll get to you in sequence, and we'll invite you to unmute and share your video at that time. Alternatively, if you just write out your question or comment in the chat box, I'll read it out in turn. There is a raise hand feature, but I think it'll be easier if we keep track of it if we just use the chat box to register that you have a question or comment. And as we are anticipating a big group today, we ask, of course, that questions and comments are posed relatively briefly. Let me thank formally the Center for Global Studies here at UVic, hosting the Middle East Discussion Group and co-hosting some of our events. And a big thanks to Stephanie at CFGS for all her work helping with promotion and the technical side of things. Thank everyone who's in attendance. And I also want to make a formal acknowledgement. I want to respectfully acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. This is something we take very seriously here, and I know everyone in my community is grappling with it. I think it's one of the most pressing issues of our time. How do we, settler colonial states, honestly approach reconciliation and justice? This is a work in progress, to say the least. Today, we are honored to have a very special guest, Abdalhadi Alijla. He's a Palestinian-Swedish social and political scientist. He has a PhD in political studies from State University of Milan. He's a recipient of several awards and scholarships from around the world. He's worked with numerous NGOs and research centers. His most recent posting is as a fellow for the Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization Project based at Lancaster University's Richardson Institute. You may have seen him in English media appearances on Al Jazeera and TRT World. His writings appear on Open Democracy, Mondo Weiss, HuffPost, Jadaliyya, many other media outlets. And his book, which we are learning about today, Trust in Divided Societies, State, Institutions, and Governance in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, is published by Bloomsbury Academics and IB Tauris in the UK. Without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Alijla.
Thank you, Michael, for introducing me, and this is a pleasure. Yeah, I mean, this is a big introduction, but I'm still young, so people think I'm quite old, but I'm still a bit young. But you know, as a Palestinian, you have always to prove yourself in every mean. You have no place to go other than proving yourself. in different places. And that's one of the reasons why many Palestinians are successful in the world. And thanks for the university for hosting me as well. The whole book here comes as an extension, or actually more than an extension, of my PhD thesis. It's my PhD thesis, only 40 to 30% of it. And then I decided in my postdoc to go on and to further and examine the question of generalized trust in divided societies. And here, what we are talking here and discussing here is the trust between strangers, between people who don't know each other. Like when you walk in the street and look around, and do I trust those people or not? And that's the question. Usually people, when they talk about trust, they think it's about trust in institutions, which is, I have a chapter on that, yes, but it's more related to institutional trust and generalized trust, and framing it in the corruption perception. This kind of a trust that I'm trying to understand, and until today, actually, I'm continuing to study generalized trust from different perspectives. Recently, I'm starting to work on a paper also about how social media affect trust in general in the Middle East, and his strikingly interesting findings you can see. And this trust is not the one that's based on self-interest, because when we talk about self-interest, because I know Michael, I trust him because I know him, I have experience, I trust my brother. It depends, but somehow. But if it's not a self-interest, but it's a generalized trust opposite to particularistic trust that between friends, family, and members. But the fear, it's the trust that's related to the fear of the person that others may exploit him or her. And that's what we are talking about. And the trust itself as a social phenomena here, it's a mean to reduce complexities and uncertainties in the society, and between people, to cope with the uncertainties in societies, like in Lebanon nowadays, in the United States, in Canada, in Sweden. And that's why we find out that societies with a high level of generalized trust are able to cope with uncertainties and in a crisis together. If it's Scandinavia, have the highest, Scandinavian countries have the highest level of generalized trust. And that's why we see that in time of uncertainties, like in coronavirus, they cope with. The second point, before I go into the details of the chapters in the book, there is here in one of my arguments in the book is about social capital. And usually we hear about social capital, and it's an important aspect. We heard about it in 1994 by the World Bank report on the relationship between social capital and economics. That's the most modern phenomenon of social capital. But many argue that social capital compromises from generalized trust as the crucial part, but also associations. Associations here means the membership associations, like in volunteer organization, church organization. But in my book, in this book, I argue that it's mostly compromised from generalized trust, because association, especially in the case of the Middle East, because associations, NGO membership in NGOs, church organizations, is usually based on politics and relationship to elites and to warlords, like in Lebanon, in Iraq, and that it can these associations or members in these associations can have a negative impact on the society, and that doesn't make sense if we talk about the social capital. So how it is social capital if it has a negative component on the society? The idea came, the idea of the book came because in 2013, usually I had an argument with a professor in Italy about the institutions and culture, and usually the Middle East framed from culture theories. Usually, okay, oh yeah, they don't have a trust because it's their culture. That's the simplistic way Mani argues, and most of Middle Eastern issues framed on through lenses of culture, history, wars, violence, but none actually see it as part of the institutionalism, institutional theories. Of course, the Belgium had war. The Europe had a war. I mean, so many were millions were killed. They had reconciliation, but then after that, they have high level of trust. So why the history didn't affect, for example, Belgium compared to Iraq or Lebanon? Of course, many would argue that it has been long-term and so on. This is somehow some justifications that's needed thorough and scientific examination. And that's where I decided to go into this road and to examine this question. And I use different to support my argument. I base the whole book on going as a pyramid from big pictures and going deeper and in depth into case studies. I use different methods. I use the qualitative methods. I lived in Lebanon and Iraq and Turkey and Palestine. I conducted in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I conducted dozens of interviews and observations, but I also use the quantitative methods based on data, thousands of survey data from the Arab Barometer and from Lebanon. Also myself, I did a survey. Then I used all of these, and then the third method, it's a qualitative comparative analysis, a QCA, where I used data from varieties of democracy institute, Quality of Governance Institute as well, and then to examine the phenomena in different countries. How I compromised the whole book in general. It's first thing after introducing the concept, generalized trust, social capital, and then the social capital and generalized trust in divided societies, theoretical frame in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East. I used a QCA method to examine the issue in 9 case studies beyond the Middle East. Not only Iraq and Lebanon were part of this chapter, but I included Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Turkey, Pakistan, South Africa, Cyprus, and of course I said Iraq and Kyrgyzstan. And why did I use this? And I use this because I wanted to examine exactly what are the main points or the main causal mechanism and which institutional conditions that affect the level of generalized trust. And from there, I could go into examining the question in different countries or in the Middle East. So because I don't want the bias, the exceptionality of the Middle East. No, I want to go from different from being the Middle East and bring thing into the Middle East. So it becomes non-exceptional. And then the next chapter the next chapter about the issue here. I mean, this chapter, I found out that there is a very clear connection between equality and equality in the meaning of safety and security, service of provision to the people, and the level of generalized trust. But another observation, the findings suggest that there is no one defined path or conditions that you take it as a receipt from the pharmacy, from policymaker or consultancy pharmacies here, and tell you if you do 1, 2, 3, then you will get high level of generalized trust. No, there are different paths. Each country needs to be contextualized in its own society, institution, but of course, the commonality between all of these cases is equality. And we find it in every society. So based on this chapter, that if you have an equal service of provision, equal treatment in every aspect of the public life, then and of course it must be represented in these institutions, then you have the capacity to have high level of generalized trust. And this later on we'll talk about that it's not easy to do so because it's an incremental and long-term harm, and it takes time. It takes time. The next chapter is which is because there is informal institutions and formal institutions, and corruption is an informal institution. And when we talk about corruption, it's corruption in formal. It's an informal institutions, and how people perceive it in the society. And how does corruption affect the level of generalized trust? We know that the corruption usually affect the level of trust in institutions, but also we know that this trust in institutions also breed corruption. So it's a mutual relationship between them. It goes hand in hand. But there was no research except one research on Mexico and in Latin America, I guess, about how corruption affect the level of generalized trust. And based on 23,000 survey from 19 countries in the Middle East, and using quantitative method, statistical method, I came to the conclusion that corruption breeds distrust in institutions, in the public institutions, and the judicial system, in the parliament, in the government, and everything. And then this distrust in institutions will affect the level of generalized trust in the society, which means that there is the corruption will end in a low level of generalized trust, because it's simple, it's logic. If you have corruption and people exploit the system, and the system it's corrupt in general, people will trust the institutions, and then they will look around and say, oh, okay, this person is exploiting the system, and then he is or she is exploiting my own rights. The trust as a cognitive science, it's like it's spread like coronavirus, the British mutation. It goes from 1 to 1. If you tell, oh, that thing is that guy, for example, or this institution is corrupt, then people will say in the society, okay, that institution is corrupt. That person who worked there is corrupt. He receives usually bribes. Then he becomes distrusted in society, and then it will become widespread in society. So This is about the corruption. The next chapters, I went actually in depth, and I decided to take 3 cases. The first case is Lebanon, Lebanon as a divided society. It's a very interesting case, especially considering the current situation in Lebanon and what's happening right now. And then I took Palestine as a politically divided society, because we don't have ethnicities in Palestine. We don't have different religions. We have Hamas and Fatah. That's a political division. And then the third case is Syria. And I selected Syria or added to the book because it's a very interesting case. You don't have data from Syria. We never have had any a quantitative data from Syria, not now, not before, except one survey in 2016, because it's forbidden to collect data in Syria, actually. And that's one of the reasons why it's one of the reasons why we in Syria, it's an interesting case, because the Ba'athification and the securitization, looking at the society from security lenses as a state, it has bred distrust. So in Lebanon, using also the Arab Barometer data from 2007 until 2019 or 2019, and conducting logistic regression and the descriptive data, plus the interviews and living in Lebanon for 2 or 3 years, I found out that's the feeling of security, insecurity, and the lack of safety in Lebanon, plus the conditions of well-being of neighbors, each other. How do you feel well-being is better than your neighbor or others? Plus the equality in receiving services, trust in civil society organizations, which is a very interesting case here, and trust in judicial systems are determinants of the level of a trust, and mostly all of them are statistically significant. I tried to have control group. I tried to change the set of data, but it's significantly it's statistically significant in all cases. And that suggests one thing, that trust is affected by the institutions. The safety and insecurity is determinant of these of feeling secure and have trust in your neighbors and have trust in people in the street. And it has nothing to do with the if he's a Christian or he's Muslim, if he's Shia or he's Sunni. It's about people in general, safety and security. And I one thing that I found that this trust between same groups, political groups, usually a groupism, I call it the groupism rather than sectarianism. They have low level of trust rather than with the outside intra groups, and that's what I found in Lebanon. Of course, I discussed in Lebanon the education. Some universities, for example, some universities in Lebanon, I hope some of the people here, participants, they know about that some universities have quota for which sect will have master student this year. So if you are a Druze, for example, you have 4 students this year, and then maybe next year you will have 6 students, but others like Christian could have more. Each sect in Lebanon have their own university. And that's led to the destruction of one of the best universities in the Middle East, the Lebanese university now, because it's a public university for everyone. So now it's suffering. The civil society organizations in Lebanon, of course, there are many good and organizations that are doing a great job there. but it has been hijacked, especially after 2005, by elites. Each one has his own NGO, and then using connections with the embassies, with the donors, and so on, they fund these kind of organization. And based on that, people started to become, okay, this NGO is for this guy. So I don't want to trust this, because it's breeding and it's producing and reproducing this kind of a groupism again. The next chapter, which is about Palestine, I spoke about the history of division in Palestine and among the Palestinians. Before, I use also the Arab Barometer survey to discuss this. And it's the same in Lebanon, like the lack of safety and insecurity in Palestine, but also you add a trust in the legal system in Palestine, because you consider 2007 when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip and they used violence there, and then they have never been any trial against who committed the crimes against the Palestinians, plus the oppression and persecutions in both the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip against youth, against women, against different oppositions, and so on. And then you have the equality and equality of services in Gaza Strip and West Bank, and violations of human rights committed by Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. They were actually the most important factors and determinants that affect the level of generalized trust in Palestine. Of course, these kind of factors are not coming from vacuum, because they represent the institutions that govern the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The last chapter before the conclusion is Syria, the chapter that focuses on Syria. And in Syria, because we don't have kind of data, so I had to rely on the data from the Syrian Center for Policy Studies in 2016, but also to go back to the historical and political causes of this trust. In Syria, you had Ba'athification of the society. There was no civil society organizations in Syria, and then you have Syrian in general were looked at from security lenses. Usually, there's a joke in Syria, which is true. It's not a joke. It's a joke maybe for us, but it's for them. It wasn't a joke. When people woke up in the morning and they hear that there are new voices of ka'ak merchants. You know what ka'ak is, Michael? The bread that usually sell in vendors in the streets. They have this cart and then push it, and then ka'ak they start to sell. And then when in Syria there is this kind of joke, when we hear a new ka'ak guy voice in the morning, we know that the mukhabarat, the security agencies, are moving around in the neighborhood, because the society was seen from security perspective. The brothers didn't know that one of them is member of the Syrian Mukhabarat. So there was no trust to talk about public issues. There was no trust on talking about social issues. So that's one of the things. The dictatorship in Syria has intensified and facilitated the lack of trust for a long time. But most recently, and this is a case of an ongoing civil war, there is a correlation between the level and intensity of violence in one area with the level of generalized trust. But also another factor that we could add here is the demographic change in Syria. There have been many attempts to change the demographics of many cities in Syria and many areas in Syria. And thousands of families were moved from one area to another area. And I met many of those guys and said, my neighbor who was there, he took over my home. So how would I trust him again? How would I see it if he took my home? So the regime itself, many of the rebels in Syria have worsened the situation by imposing kind of demographic change. Then the last chapter is about Syrians in Lebanon, divided societies actually, and I talk about the relationship between Syrians and Lebanese in there. One of the things is I noticed working with the Syrian refugees there also that as a whole and living in Lebanon and their host community is that they don't have communication with them. They don't interact on the personal level. And that's why it allows exploitation of them. The NGOs that works in Lebanon, they contributed to the segregation between Lebanese and Syrians. They provided services for only for Syrians for many years before paying attention that we need also to contribute to the host community. And that's caused a really big gap. In sum, my book argues that inequality, corruption, distrust in civil society organizations is very important factors to increase trust in divided societies. And the whole thing that institutions in the Middle East are important and the crucial determinants of the level of generalized trust. And it's not about culture. And that's one thing. Finally, the 3 points that we need to pay attention to is that generalized trust is predictable and incremental. And in the meaning that it's easy to destroy generalized trust, but it's hard to build it and rebuild it. And if you want to rebuild it, it will take 5-6 years in order to just try to rebuild it. And that's why we can also predict which factors can contribute to building or destroying. Then, low level of generalized trust has long-term harm. So if you destroy level of a trust and goes low, then it will have a very long harm. And Lebanon and Iraq and even Bosnia and Herzegovina, look at them. The situation is there. It has long-term harm because these societies didn't actually focus on the concept of equality, of services, about the trust in judicial system, trust in the civil society organizations, and segregation. And the last thing is about territorial segregations, which is related to many things. In the case of Palestine, case of Lebanon, and the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the more we have territorial segregation, even on neighborhoods level, we will have a low level of generalized trust because this breed distrust and skepticism in the society. And that's my presentation for the book. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Abdalhadi. There's so much there. It raises so many questions, and I think I'm going to maybe abuse my moderator position to pose a question to you, but I think it's just fast. Forgive me, I haven't had a chance to go over the book, but you speak about institutions and equality as sort of as key determinants of the presence of trust or generalized trust in society. And I gather from your remarks that the institutions you speak about are mostly state and not so much sort of civil society institutions, or is that encompassed in your use of institutions? And let me just add to that too. One thing that I always think about in these sorts of discussions that didn't come up in your remarks has to do with, well, speaking of divided societies, the age-old imperial traditions of divide and conquer, the colonial question, the post-colonial question, the Middle East being the most intervened upon region of the world. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, and then we'll start going to some questions from our audience.
Thank you, Michael. Oh, the first question about the which institutions. I talk here about the formal institutions. If we talk about because safety and security is represent actually how the state agencies govern the society, how they provide services. It's about service provision, which is the formal institutions. It's the policy tools. We understand it as what are the policy tools that these institutions use to implement their policies. And here exactly the point. So I'm talking here about the formal institutions, but also I'm talking about the informal institution of corruption here, which also represent the state. That's one thing. But when you ask about the civil society organization, I added it because I didn't actually had this kind of thing that the civil society organization may have an effect on the level of generalized trust. But when I was working on the field, I felt people are talking about NGOs as dukkana. You have this shop, everyone has his own shop or dukkana. So this is triggered somehow in my mind. Okay, then people are affected. They don't have trust in this, and that's when one guy told me like, my neighbor take it from that dukkana NGO, from another NGO, and they give him better than me. So that's where I started to think civil society organizations, charter organization could be also a determinant in that sense. And because elites and political figures use civil society organizations to divide the people, to provide services, to buy loyalties, and to nepotism and patrimonialism. So it represents also a formal gap, a gap into the formal institution, state institution, and state machinery. About the second question about the legacy of colonialism. Well, I mean, if we talk about Lebanon, I mean, Lebanon is the case of unfinished business from the French mandate. It's a cell. I mean, it's a legacy. If we talk about Palestine, it's unfinished business from the British mandate, from the British colonization. If we talk about Iraq, even Iraq didn't have this intense legacy of colonization. Like Palestine and compared to Palestine and France, I think Iraq also suffered from the interventions, the colonial powers interventions, even in 2003. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's about the same. When colonial power, you know that I'm sure many of you know that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is the High Commissioner, who is a European guy, who said as a conflict resolution guy, but he is not. He is actually the actual president of Bosnia and Herzegovina since 1995. He is the one who could order 600 European police army actually to go and even arrest one president of those tribal presidents of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it's a colonial power. It's everything is it's about colonial power, but that about the history itself in general. But no, I'm talking here about the institutions. And when we talk about the institutions of segregation, of nepotism, buying loyalism, and so on, it's represented in these institutions. So of course, there is an effect, I think.
Okay, I really appreciate that. There's so much on the table. I encourage folks to think about what aspects they might appreciate you going a little bit more deeply into. We have a question, I think, from Oliver Schmidtke, our own director of the Center for Global Studies here. Oliver, are you here? Do you want to beam in?
Yeah, I hope you can see me. Abdalhadi, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Clearly, you address one of the crucial questions of our time, particularly for the region. So wonderful to see your work out in print. I have a difficult question and an easy one. So let's start with a difficult one that picks up on Michael's point about conceptual clarity. And maybe I can ask you to just go over again the relationship between what you describe as generalized trust in society and trust in institutions. At the end of your presentation, you seem to suggest that really it is the eroding trust in institutions that has an effect on broader trust in society, that erodes, this very fabric that generates trust. At the same time, however, you seem to suggest at some stage as well that it is really this general social trust that would allow for democratic reforms, for rebuilding these institutions. I'm just wondering how circular this argument then goes, and to put it differently, how could we rebuild trust? If indeed we are confronted in the region with lots of institutions that in a way tend to erode trust rather than build it, would, that's Michael's question as well, right? How in civil society could you start even imagining rebuilding this critical resource for a democratic society? So that was probably the more difficult one. And the other one would be, when you do all this, wonderful research, you have all this data, what surprised you the most in terms of your empirical research insight, right? Yeah, you told us a story about how, a conversation with your professor started you off on this trajectory. Is there something in your research that surprised you really, something that is counterintuitive? Because some of the things that you tell, the stories, right, that corruption erodes trust, seems to be quite straightforward. I'm just wondering whether you have you were really surprised by your empirical analysis.
Thank you, Oliver. And to pick up on the first question, they generalize trust and trust in institutions. There is there has been an ongoing discussion and debate between different theorists and researchers about which one affect the other, the level of generalized trust and on institutional trust, or vice versa, institutional trust on generalized trust. Here is what I did is I used the new method, simultaneous equation modeling, in a statistical analysis, which is to examine exactly if both of them affect each other or one of them affect the other. Because if you conduct the same, use logistic regression method, but normally both of them will affect each other. That will be normal, so it doesn't count. But with this method, a simultaneous equation modeling, it's a very complex statistical method that we use in social science to grasp what is really happening on the ground. To make one of them is constant. For example, it goes 3 levels. Simultaneous equation modeling. One level is to examine one to the other, A against B, then B against A, then on the 3 levels difference, and then we get the outcome of this. And what I found here is based on different questions here, and different, the perception of corruption, the trust in institutions, which institutions, the parliament, the government, the service provisions, the local government, and so on, that there is much mutual effect. That if you have low level of generalized trust, that would allow for corruption breeding. So you would have, it will allow for more corruption, because I know I wouldn't trust some people. I don't trust the people here in Jena. So I need to bribe, for example, to use my connections to get a job for my son, or to get a job for myself, to swear for the sake of my sectarian leader, so I could feel protected. And then this would breed distrust in institutions. That's simple, that's logical, but that's the whole thing is against the theorists who claim that culture is the one that affect the level of and determine the level of generalized trust in the Middle East. But the opposite side is when we have low level of trust in institutions, then for the fact, generally, okay, I don't trust them. Simply, I need to use every possible mechanism, legally or illegally, using corruption, patrimonialism, nepotism, to get what I want. Because I know if I don't get it, somebody else will get it by different means. And that's what usually people told me. And it eroded. But when also, what I found striking here is that the level of generalized trust between people, it seems to determine many things in the society, not only against trust institutions, not against or even corruption itself, the perception of corruption, because we don't know how to measure corruption as a real thing. We just measure perception of corruption. But generalized trust usually also affect people who get married. Like in Gaza, people would start after 2007 start to ask if the family of the bride is Hamas or Fatah, if they are secular or non-secular. And this is affected, and this is because people started to distrust each other. In Lebanon also, and not only because of the non-existence of civic law and different religious sectarian laws, people avoid sometimes dating or getting married from different sects. Of course, you have many cases they go to Cyprus, get married, and come back. But this is also is a representation of the lack of trust in the society. But your second part of the question, how we could, as civil society organization, build a trust? There's not easy question to answer, but I can, from my own observations in difference. One thing is we need to ease as formal institutions, as laws, the entry and exit of civil society organization. And what I mean here is, one, the formal institutions don't need to have this complex bureaucratic mechanism and to have an NGO. For example, if you want to establish an NGO in Lebanon, for example, some people told me you need like 1 year to wait, or I think some people 5 years, waited for 5 years sometime to establish an NGO. Of course, now it's more easy. In Palestine, if you need to do an NGO, you would need to apply to have charter, and then to pay some money, and then you have to have 9 people or 7 people, and then you have to apply for the Minister of Interior. And then the Minister of Interior have to send it to the security agencies to see if you are really can pose security threat. And this is a mean to shut up opposition leaders and people who have certain ideologies and opinions. In Syria, civil society doesn't exist. This is one way. This is the first way, the entry of civil society organization. Second, the funding of civil society organization should be from it must be owned by the people, and the PPT, public-private partnership, should focus on NGOs at a grassroots level and not the big sharks. In Palestine, in Lebanon, in most all countries, you have this, what we call it, the big sharks. The NGOs, that suck all the international donations. So you find an NGO that's receives $2 million a year, and it does good job, but the CEO of the NGO receive $5,000 as a salary, but the same in the same city as another NGO do the same thing and much better, and the CEO or the trainer receive just $500. So this NGOs usually mostly related to two types. One is the elites, and here I'm talking about the elites in the society who have good connections with the foreign donors, and those have certain people. The beneficiaries are usually none who are going to receive benefits of these programs and interventions and programs. And then you have the second one is the I call it the groupism leaders NGOs. This leader or warlord, let me say, or society lord in a new term, establish an NGO or indirectly supervise for his wife, for his one of his agents, and so on. And then based on that, with the connections with the donors, they get money, they do programs for their own people in the group, in the same group, and not the same set. So here it's to do that, then we need to defund and kill these NGOs that abuse the meaning and the phenomena and the rule of civil society organizations. And the third mean to do that, NGOs have a very important role, is you don't have to focus on your group only. You need to have to include everybody in the society from different sects, to provide a space for people from different sects to engage together. And that could be a partial answer. If I want to, maybe I can go on later on that. About, yeah, you have what surprised me actually. What surprised me in the question is, and this is I always talk about that, and it's always surprised me very much until today. Civil wars and wars in societies like these divided societies, and the causes of the division in these societies was made to not end, and it will continue from the talks of the people. From when I was in Bosnia, for example, when I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I met 15, 16, 17 years old teenagers, many of them from the 3 different sects, they told me, we are waiting the next war because they want revenge. And of course, many of them were not born before that. And in Lebanon, even you have a strong mobilization and voices against war. But if you look at the social media, and if you look at people, how they speak on the ground, you would feel like the war, yes, it is stopped by guns, but it's going on different means. In Gaza, even if you have, and Palestine in general, and Syria the same, in Palestine, even politically divided societies, you still people vote to revenge from Hamas and from Fatah. So that's surprising for me, because I feel that when reconciliations agreements and reconciliation efforts are put in there, they merely and rarely actually focus on rebuilding the humans. They rebuild buildings, concrete, and some art galleries and shopping malls, but they never focus to rebuild people.
Thank you, Abdalhadi. Sobering, reflections on the long-lasting division of society. But thank you very much for this insight.
So we're getting a few questions lined up here. Why don't we invite Rod DeBell to pose his question, and then maybe we'll take the next two questions from the chat room in a pair together. Go ahead, Rod.
So thank you very much indeed. Very, very interesting, although, as Oliver says, very sobering, particularly these last observations. I have a question which I guess opens up a lot of abstract territory, and you may want to move on to more relevant questions. But your major conclusion, if I understand it, is that this loss or low level of generalized trust is not about culture, that there's something else there. But I'm wondering, you talk about institutions, formal and informal, and you talk about the problems of groupism. What are you seeing in culture beyond those considerations and the influence of religion and caste, sect, and so on? I'm wondering, what is it, in a sense, that you're excluding as you exclude culture as a determinant?
Thank you very much. And it's a very interesting question, especially about religion, the role of religion. About the formal and informal institutions, I talk about the formal institutions and their policy tools, usually the government, the security agencies, the judicial system, the local municipalities and so on that provide services. And then the only part I talk about informal institution is corruption. One chapter that I talk about corruption, and corruption is informal institution, because you would never we would never find a government that say corruption is one of our aims to increase corruption. It's an informal or corruption is part of our work. So it's about an informal institution here in the corruption. But about the groupism, and this is related to Buberker on sectarianism, and I use it instead of sectarianism, because usually people frame the civil war in Lebanon as a sectarian civil war, for example, but it's not, because you could find many Christians, Lebanese were fighting beside the Palestinians, and you would find many Muslims fight with the Christian Maronites. Actually, one of the leaders of the Christian Maronite phalanx were Palestinian, and you would find, for example, Shia, so it's not, it's even after the civil war in Lebanon, currently it's about a groupism. I avoid sectarianism because it's not really sectarianism, and I usually cite and base my argument on Rima Majid, one of our bright women researchers from Lebanon, and then the sectarian. I avoided also to use sectarianism in Syria because it has been sectarianized by the regime, because the revolution, Syrian revolution, started as calls for reform, and from all and every part of the society, including many of the Shia Alawit. But then it has been sectarianized by the regime because it's an easy way to sectarianize it. And when when you have a sectarianized revolution, it's easy to shut them down and to shut the revolution down and to take over everything. And that's one of the reasons I use groupism. About the culture and religion, actually, I tried to use in my statistical methods how religious are you based on how many numbers you pray every day, and if you go to Friday prayers, and if you read Quran. So I aggregated because I want to understand, maybe it could be religion has an effect on the level of trust. And I aggregated them into one factor to see if there is really effect or not. No, there is no. I didn't find any correlation. And I can tell you funny stories from Palestine that people don't trust imams and sheikhs. So, so how you would feel? And I have written a paper actually, and it hasn't been published, also statistical analysis about prejudice, and if really religious people are racist or not. And I found one of the findings that people who sometimes pray Fajr, you know what, praying Fajr in the morning at 4 o'clock at mosque, to go and wait in the best time of sleeping and to go to mosque, I found that many of them, or 20 or not, 21 of them, they are racist. And this is because if I try to aggregate it with other questions from the survey, because they use these prayers and religious manifestation to gain political power for political reason. So like if you want to seem pious in Palestine or in Egypt or even in Lebanon or even in any Arab Middle Eastern country, then you can go to the mosque and they pray Fajr every day. Then they will say, then everybody will say, he pray Fajr every morning. So how would you, how he could exploit, or how could we distrust him? He is a pious man, but usually he is, for example, has prejudice, he's a racist and so on.
Rod, did you want to follow up on that? I think you're content.
I am content. Thank you very much indeed.
So we do have two questions from audience members. One was sent directly in through the chat messages to me. Someone in attendance named S. Tonzi has posed this question. Let me just read this out. Thank you for this session. I have a question regarding the case of Lebanon, especially after the 4th of August. Of course, referring to that big blast.
That's where I survived.
It'd be great to hear any reflections or your thought or experience about that. Actually, now that you mention it, I remember seeing you posting some pictures of some blown out windows, if I'm not mistaken. How could trust be rebuilt in the state apparatuses? How could shifting towards a different state system, for example, debates about moving towards a federal system in Lebanon, affect or build trust? Thank you.
Well, in Lebanon, there's a very interesting case in Lebanon. And I have been always interested. And I remember in 2015, I think the one who asked the question could Lebanese maybe. And in 2015, when the ريحتكم طلعت ريحتكم, we smell you, you stink movement in Lebanon. I frankly, from the day two, actually told many of my friends in Lebanon that it's not going to work, because very simple, because the next days, some of the political elites and political leaders sent to some Lebanese youth in the movement, and then they content them. And they when they started كل يعني كل, all means all. But when they started to name the political leaders, then the division started again. So in Lebanon, the main problem, before you mentioned federal system, it doesn't work. Lebanon is a small country. It's a very small country. It doesn't have resources. And if you want to do a federal system, it's not going to work. The only thing in Lebanon is about the building a system, political system for everybody in Lebanon, based on citizenship and not based on the religious affiliation. Because in Lebanon, it's based, currently, everything is based on the 18 officially recognized sect. How could you run a country of 10,000 square kilometer or 10,004 square kilometer with the 18 different laws, with sectarianized attitudes of leaders, without transitional justice? Because you have many of the warlords in Lebanon participated and killed thousands of Lebanese during the civil war. Now they are leaders. You can't just go move on in a country and to rebuild the country and then say, okay, we need to build the trust, and then we need to have an institution without actually persecuting the real cause and the persons who committed the crimes and building a judicial system. So first thing we need to do in Lebanon is fair, independent, and professional judicial system. That's the first thing, because people, if they don't feel secure and don't trust the judicial system, the whole thing is nothing. Second, you need to rebuild the whole institutions far from the constitutional democracy. It's not actually a democracy. I would call constitutional procedures of democracy, because it's not actually, I wouldn't perceive it as a democracy, because it's a mean and a process to manage the public life, elections and elections, appointments, presidential, prime minister, and so on. So it's not a real democracy. You need to abolish the constitutionalism there, and then based on the professionalism. And of course, there is a symbolic way to have a president as a Maronite prime minister. This could be somehow a symbolic way, which is fine. But in the constitutionalism in Lebanon, which for many who doesn't know, that they decide how many ambassadors and how many consulars from different sects and to which countries they have to assign them. They decide how many employees, even workers, they decide based on their sect and not based on their, if they have legitimacy, if they have professional career, if they have certificates, if they have, it doesn't work. It doesn't work like this. The third thing is the rebuilding civil society organizations. Again, we need to rebuild the whole civil society organizations in Lebanon. Lebanon, after 2005, was one of the most amazing places in the region to have regional NGOs. But then in the last 5 years, it diminished, and almost every NGO and regional NGO is thinking to move, for example, to Jordan, and that's because of the situation, not security, but because the government itself has been tightening on these NGOs, and they want to push to abuse and exploit these NGOs for some sects and some political leaders. And then the last point I would argue about in Lebanon, if we want to build on Lebanon, is the constitution, the Taif agreement. If the one who asked the question, the Taif agreement wasn't actually implemented fully. They didn't implement every article in the Taif agreement, just part of it that serve political elites. And finally, final thing on that. Al-Taif agreement is one of the agreements in the region, beside Oslo Accord, Dayton Agreement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Al-Taif agreement, and perhaps the next agreement in Syria. Those were designed not to change. And if Al-Taif agreement need to be changed, then either a civil war or a will from regional powers and international powers. And so far, we can see that some regional powers need to change in Lebanon, and there is a possibility to do so. And that's very dangerous narrative. So either we go to Al-Ta'if and they implement Al-Ta'if now, which they disagree now, many of the political leaders in Lebanon, or you go to the next level of violence.
Thank you. Let's go back into the chat room. We have a question here from Hamid Georgiani. In looking at the cause-effect relationships, did you consider cyclical impacts of some of the key events which might have contributed to the origin of distrust? The Great Game, the World Wars, Suez Crises, Brzezinski's Green Crescent of Islam to soften the belly of the USSR?
Well, it's a good question, but these events are very old. That's the thing is, because the trust usually have 5 years gap to change. And that's why value surveys worldwide are done and conducted every 5 years. Trust is very hard to measure, but also it's very hard to change. So I can't change, for example, if I want to see if a certain policies have contributed to trust, increase the trust, then I would need to measure them 5 years after the start of implementation. But when an event trigger situation, the trust collapses very fast in an accelerating way. And that's why if we talk about World War II, World War I, and Suez Crisis, it's very long time. It has more than 30, 40 years, and their effect wouldn't be visible now. So it has been eroded or rebuilt upon by other institutions and other things. Plus, many of the regimes we are examining now, they are actually after all of these.
That's fascinating, this 5-year time frame, but as an approximation, sort of people responding to and sort of the feedback loop between people and their experience of institutions. But surely these massive cataclysmic events have a long, far-reaching aftershocks beyond that. Let me just jump to Martin Bunton's question. He's asking if you have any reflections on the upcoming Palestinian elections.
What exactly? There are so many thoughts about that, actually, honestly. But what exactly? I'm not optimistic. I mean, the upcoming elections is a way that both Hamas and Abbas are using to legitimize themselves without paying a real price for that for the people. Indeed, the elections will produce and reproduce the same policies. The problem with Palestinians is not actually who represent them. It's about the strategy and what the Palestinians want. So far, you have two different programs, Hamas program and Abbas program. And none of them have given or provided the Palestinian anything so far. They are standing there alone. The Palestinians are suffering in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Israel is eating the West Bank. They building a settler colonial apartheid state with everybody from the sea to the river and from everywhere with different system, judicial system, from different political systems. And then Abbas is still saying, "Oh, I'm with peace and negotiations." But what kind of peace and negotiation? So people are like, really? So that's amazing how he is really confident of himself about two-state solution. Meanwhile, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, they have this idea of resistance, military resistance. And we know that many Palestinians know that military resistance doesn't pay off. That the Palestinians in Gaza can't go every 5 years or 4 years in a new Israeli genocide to try and experiment in new weapons and new stuff, and then to what we call it in Gaza, to gas ratio, to cut their feather so they don't become strong. So we keep them as them. So the Palestinian elections it will not change the lives of the Palestinians. Abbas wanted that because he wanted to look legitimate in front of Biden administration. And I don't know why he cares about Biden. And I don't know if Biden cares about him, honestly. And then Hamas want to jump off the boat. There is a sinking boat in Gaza Strip, and Hamas want to jump off this sinking boat and to give the steering and the wheels to somebody else. And the only way to do that is to have elections. And they, what I'm afraid of is we have two scenarios. Hamas win, then everybody will start to slap Hamas again. We will go back to square zero. And that's normal because we know that what's going on, including Egypt. But then if Hamas didn't win the elections, and then Hamas would never compromise the security of the Gaza Strip. They will not let Abbas and his security forces take over Gaza Strip. And then we will come back again to the square zero. So then what is the value of having an elections now if we don't agree on the matters, on the Palestinian strategy of struggle, what we want as Palestinians, for example. So that's my comment on that.
There seems to be, too, I think, a bit of a public misperception when they hear that there's these elections going on, as if the elections have meaningful consequence, that whoever wins is going to end up with sovereignty or be in any kind of position to make decisions about, natural resources, the economy, of course, security and territory, international trade. They just don't have any of those powers, no matter who wins. So the fact that there are these elections and these different governments in charge, I feel it often can give people in the West the impression that what this is a conflict between two states, between Israel and Palestine. And it occludes or hides the fact that really only one state, one government controls the lives of all, whether it's Hamas in the Gaza Strip or Abbas and his Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So the whole thing kind of, to me, boils down to a bit of a charade that doesn't really advance the Palestinian struggle in international perceptions in any way.
Absolutely, but also there's a very important point here that the elections is only for the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and maybe East Jerusalem, but it doesn't represent all the Palestinians. That's the issue. You have 6 million Palestinian refugees outside of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So who does represent them? How they select their own representatives? The elections is only for the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authorities is a self-determination according to the Oslo Accord, a bureaucratic body that provides services to the people in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So after 2005 and after 2000, actually, the second Intifada, the Palestinian Authority has been transformed to a security tool only to serve Israeli security needs. It doesn't have any meaning, and instead, Israel has to be responsible for everything in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but then the Palestinian Authority do, but they don't have any sovereignty. And then the Palestinian Authority is taking over the PLO, which is the sole representative of the Palestinian people. So I never seen a small body take over big body. But it's only the case of the Palestinian, like Palestinian Authority, which is part of the PLO, is taking over the mother is the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
So I think we're running out of time, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody who's attended, and especially to thank you for giving us your time and this insight into this remarkable research and all the questions that come out of it. I don't see any more questions. I do want to quickly point out that our previous book talk by Hani Hilmi that we did a couple months back is just recently now online on YouTube. So our Middle East discussion group book talk by Hani Hilmi is available. And I'm just wondering if I can maybe squeeze in one last question, and feel free to give a very brief answer. I don't know if this is a way that you approached your research at all, but I kept wondering as you were speaking, if you did sort of a comparative between the societies of Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and maybe Iraq as well, how do they compare in terms of trust amongst each other? Which society, how would you even rank them perhaps as to societies who trust their neighbors better, who trust their institutions better, or is that just not an approach that you went into this project with?
Well, there is a way to actually rank them, and it's by calculating the percent of people who do trust or distrust, and then divide it by 100 or multiply by 100 or have this certain thing. But Lebanon is the second country in the world that have highest people distrust each other, and it has been increasing over time. I remember in 2007, only I think 70, 75 people said we don't trust each other. And then in 2012 or 13, 80 something, 82. But the most recent is more than 90, unfortunately, don't trust each other in Lebanon. And they feel that people would exploit them. And then Iraq, in Syria, there is no rank because we don't have data all over Syria. And the data, the available data from the Syrian Center is only for some regions. And that doesn't give an indications, real indications of that. But if I would say that in Syria, it could be ranked similar to, or not similar, but less after Lebanon. And then Iraq could be also around, I think 84% who don't trust each other on the latest data set. And Iraq is we need to consider that Iraq is also a tribal society. So they have a tribal code of conduct, and that's informal code of conduct, which I think it's maybe one of my papers later on will be about the tribal code of conduct and generalized trust as an informal mechanism to constrain and to punish and to be a tool of judicial safety and solidarity in the society. But Palestine, I think it has the highest rate among the 4 countries of trust, but still none of them goes less than 50% or 60% actually.
Okay, well, thank you so much on behalf of everybody here. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. And maybe one day, not too soon, we'll get to see you here. Have you come over to this part of the world perhaps one day?
Inshallah, hopefully, yeah, after Corona.
All right, thanks everybody.